Masculinity is an undeniable factor in determining male attractiveness, but there's an important caveat. Masculinity itself exists on a spectrum. This means both masculine and pretty men can score highly in terms of facial attractiveness, despite their differences. Ratings are not binary, and it's about time we analyze this. Welcome to Chadify, where we'll establish the ultimate Looksmaxxing guide that explores the unique properties of masculinity and their role on male attractiveness. My website, Chadify.me, is the ultimate hub where you can get your face analyzed and chatified with custom tailored advice for your unique situation. The link is in the description. So, what exactly is a masculine man? Alternatively, what makes a man pretty? Is it hair, lips, skin? It all boils down to dimorphic traits. The term dimorphism typically refers to the two distinctive forms of individuals within a species, often characterized by subtle differences that set them apart. When it comes to humans, dimorphism is often associated with the dissimilarities between males and females, beyond their reproductive organs, from rounder brow ridges to softer facial features and weaker jaws. These differences play a massive role in determining masculinity. However, many people do not realize that this is also present between males. There are 13 dimorphic traits which differentiate prettier and more masculine men. So we got the three different archetypes: hyper-masculine men, the renowned Chad, and pretty boys on the right. We're gonna fill out each attribute and how they differ. Chin to philtrum ratio. The hyper-masculine men can get away and in fact benefit from an overdeveloped chin. This means that a 2.75 to 1 chin philtrum ratio is actually more attractive on him than a 2.25 to 2.5 to 1 ratio. Whereas with a pretty boy, it's the exact opposite. In fact, a pretty boy benefits from having a shorter, smaller chin relative to the typical Chad ratios. This leads directly into the thirds of the jaw. Hypermasculine men also benefit from an overdeveloped chin region that is both longer and wider. For pretty boys, it's the exact opposite, where a smaller chin region is deemed more attractive, or at least equal thirds of the jaw. Onto nose size. In Western societies, especially, having a big nose is not a very attractive feature for both males and females. However, for hypermasculine men, this feature has little importance. In fact, having a slightly bigger, broader nose can be very attractive. Him having this wider nose is more attractive for his unique circumstances than a pretty boy's small, refined, and defined nose. Additionally, eye height to width ratio. Most men benefit from hunter eyes. That's a 3 to 1 ratio of the width to height. However, for pretty boys, they can actually get away with anywhere between the range of 2 to 1 and 3 to 1. So they can get away with slightly rounder eyes. However, for a hypermasculine man, having anywhere from 3 to 1 to 4 to 1 is very attractive. I think it's pretty obvious by the shading and the darkness that a hypermasculine man has extremely deep set eyes. His eyes are so far back that they give him an intimidating, angry, and almost terrifying look. Whereas for the pretty boy, having average set to maybe slightly deep set eyes is very attractive. The hypermasculine man practically has no eyebrow distance. In fact, in the inner region of his eyebrow, it almost looks like it's connected. You go over to the pretty boy here and he can get away with more distance, kind of like a Justin Bieber type look, a friendlier, welcoming appearance. The hypermasculine man practically has a Neanderthal-like structure. He benefits from having this extremely defined brow ridge and rigid bone structure. You go over to the pretty boy and he has far less of the ape-like appearance and a much rounder and more feminine brow ridge. Hair. Every single man benefits from thick, youthful hair. But the truth is, for a hypermasculine man, having a higher hairline and having some recession or thinning won't destroy his appearance, especially if he shaves his head. Whereas with a pretty boy, having a very low hairline and even longer hair in some cases is highly beneficial. They benefit benefit from a feminine hairstyle appearance. Muscular content. This one's a huge one because every single man will benefit from gaining muscle. The difference here is massive. As a hypermasculine man, you cannot get away without having muscle. It will destroy your appearance. However, as a pretty boy, this is where it differs. Sure, they look good when they're athletic, but they don't require a plethora of muscle on their frame. As a result, it's a less important feature for them unless they become more masculine looking over time. Skin texture. Hypermasculine men can get away with a slightly drier or even oilier skin appearance. It doesn't need to be flawless and blemish free. You go over to the pretty boy and I applied a Gaussian blur to this. Why? Because I'm exaggerating the idea that he needs to have perfect poreless skin in essence. Thirds of facial width. Let's just refer to the Chad for a second. The Chad has to have equal thirds of his facial width. Well, a hypermasculine man does not. In fact, he can get away with a much longer lower third due to his overdeveloped jaw and chin appearance. Of course, he still has a compact mid face, whereas for the pretty boy, it's somewhat different. The pretty boy requires a short upper third. The higher the pretty boy's hairline gets, the less pretty he will look. On the other hand, he can get away with having a narrowing lower third. He doesn't actually need to have a perfectly square or wide jaw. He has a smaller chin, a smaller jaw, and more feminine features. Neck size. Both men actually have quite wide necks. It might not look like it, but it's partly due to the fact that the pretty boy actually has a thinner face anyways. His face width is still only 1.2 times his neck width, so it's still within that 5/4 range, which is attractive. Whereas the hypermasculine man pretty much has a neck which is as wide as his jaw region. Anyways. Finally, lip size. You can see that hypermasculine men don't require as full lips as pretty boys. It's not that having thick lips as a hypermasculine man is not attractive. It's rather the fact that they're less important. They're less of a defining factor which makes them attractive. Whereas for a pretty boy, having plump, thick, and feminine lips actually benefits them. This looks like a lot of text. I get it. Basically, this is what we just talked about. We defined each attribute for each archetype. In the past videos and my future videos, a lot of the focus is going to be on the Chad. This is the happy medium between pretty boys and hypermasculine men. What happens if you're outside of these boundaries? Is it good, bad, confusing? What is going on out there? Introducing the cartoon zone, which I've heard no one talk about just yet. This happens when you have features that are collective outside of a certain archetype or range of masculinity. When it's outside of the norm, beware, this area will negatively impact your attractiveness severely. An example is Jay Leno. With his massive chin, masculine features, including his big nose, you can tell that the guy resides within the cartoon zone. It's not to say that Jay Leno is an ugly guy or anything like that. Rather, he simply is not within our typical spectrum of masculinity. He's in the cartoon zone, on the masculine side. On the other hand, we have Hasbullah. He is absolutely on the other side of the cartoon zone. And of course, they both have different conditions for their circumstances. I'm not trying to make fun. Rather, I'm just trying to say that they do not reside in the typical masculinity spectrum. Introducing the rating scale. I found that the previous rating scales did not address masculinity whatsoever. It's about time we had a multi-axis scale for rating people accurately. Here it is. So we got the 1 to 9, and then we got the masculinity blend. Pretty blend is Chad. Maximum points are going to be labeled as these white dots. Other points in the middle are going to be labeled as these gray points. And finally, the black hole, which represents the worst rating you could get. Reintroducing the perfect hypermasculine man. So you can see right here that he scores a 5 out of 10 in terms of attractiveness from the Chad spectrum. So right in the middle, he's actually just rated a 5. However, from the masculine rating lens, he scores an 8. He's literally perfect from this tail end spectrum. On the other hand, from the pretty spectrum, he scores a 2. A female that's into very pretty guys. The pretty's really right at the 3 level here. We're talking about soft boys, the prettiest of them all. Some people are into that, and the people that are into that will never give a guy like this a chance or even a second look because they're simply not into this archetype. And that exactly applies to the fact that people are also into masculine men, and those ones will find him highly attractive. So it'll be the opposite effect. As we work our way down, now we're introducing the masculine guy. He's not a hyper masculine guy, so his features are between the hypermasculine, the Chad, and a bit of pretty mixed in. He's much closer to the masculine side, as denoted by his 8 out of 10 attractiveness for the slightly masculine area here. However, from a very masculine, like the giga masculine lens, he only scores a 7. From the Chad lens, he scores a 6, and so on. As we work our way down more, here comes the Chad. With the perfect balance of all features, there is no lopsided effect here, and his curve is very much basic, very attractive. Then we got the perfect pretty boy. Got some masculine features, but he's definitely closer to the prettier side. And then finally, the soft boy. This is going way to that end of pretty, further than most YouTubers would ever talk about in terms of prettiness. And as a result, his curve is very much skewed. All of these men are equally attractive in different realms of masculinity. Sure, they're all completely different, but they're all perfect in their own unique ways. The hypermasculine man is perfect from this rating criteria. As we work our way down, the soft boy is perfect from that extreme pretty perspective, while the Chad is right in the middle. They're all 8s. They're all equally attractive. However, it gets interesting because they are unequally unattractive. The soft boy and the hypermasculine man can score all the way down to a 2 out of 10 in terms of attractiveness because they're effectively within a niche. As we work our way up, the masculine man, not hypermasculine, the masculine man and the pretty boy are definitely a little bit more balanced, yet still score 3 out of 10 in terms of attractiveness at that tail end. Chad is unique. Chad has a minimum rating of 6 out of 10. This means the Chad never falls below a 6 out of 10 in terms of attractiveness. The typical Chad preference would receive each man, the hypermasculine a 5, the Chad 8, and the soft boy would receive a 5, normie territory. From a hypermasculine preference, it would be 8, 6, and 2 respectively. Whereas from a soft boy preference, the hypermasculine man would only score 2, the Chad a 6, and the soft boy an 8. I know right now, some people are gonna comment, how in the world does a Chad ever get a 6? He's always an 8. And the truth is, it's because of one massive thing. These are the tail ends of the spectrum of masculinity. We are talking about the rarest situations here, when we push the boundary near the cartoon zone. When you push something that far, yes, Chad will not fall into some people's niches. Some people will look at this guy and would rather have this guy 9 times out of 10. And that's very rare, but it happens. And when that happens, Chad is really just receiving a 6. And a 6 is not bad. It's very uncommon to have women or people in general prefer men that are on either side of this spectrum. Rather, they typically prefer Chad. As a result, this is how it's arranged via prevalence. When I say prevalence, what I mean is that most females, and just in general, you ask anyone, they're going to prefer Chad, and they're gonna give him an 8. But there's gonna be a smaller minority of people who rate him a 7 because they have a bias towards a more feminine or a more masculine man. And this stretches all the way out to the outer extremities where they would give him a 6 at the lowest. There is no way that Chad will ever fall below a 6, and it is extremely rare, hence the tiny font, that Chad would ever get a 6 out of 10. And the same applies for all these small numbers across for each archetype. Masculine preference, see that? Makes much more sense. When other creators like to discuss masculinity and hypermasculine men, they actually refer to the masculine preference. This is not the hypermasculine preference. In the masculine preference, this guy actually only gets a 7. The Chad also gets a 7, and the pretty boy gets only a 3, because he doesn't fit that criteria. Whereas the pretty boy preference, the soft boy will get a 7 out of 10 in terms of attractiveness, whereas the Chad will get a 7, still high. This makes way more sense, and the hypermasculine will only get a 3. So we can see here that it's really this range, the 3 closest numbers here, which denote the common ratings for each archetype. There's a 6-point spread for the hypermasculine and the soft boy. That's massive. There is a ton of nuance in their ratings. They do fit into a niche. Whereas Chad only has a 2-point spread at the maximum. Chad is effectively always attractive. He has the largest dating pool and mass appeal. Character roles in movies, success in real life. This is the look right here for maximum versatility. Well, what do we do with all this information? We've just talked about a ton of different things here. Looksmaxxing must take masculinity into consideration. Niches drastically alter Looksmaxxing plans. Here is the Chad. He's already maxed out. What do I mean by this? This is his graph right here. We've already displayed all these idealistic male archetypes. They have no flaws, rather they just fit into different masculinities. As a result, Chad cannot do this. This is effectively impossible. He cannot be an 8 across all ranges of masculinity because he's only an 8 from the blend perspective. His curve cannot be linear. That's impossible for any man. This is the key takeaway of this video. Introducing Looksmaxxing flow diagrams. Boom. This flow diagram demonstrates a specific grouping of Looksmaxxing techniques. These Looksmaxxing techniques benefit all levels of masculinity equally. Losing fat benefits any man. Orthodontics benefits anyone with teeth-related issues. Teeth whitening, mewing, proper skincare, business casual clothing, canthoplasty, blepharoplasty, eyelid fillers, and many other surgeries. This is a uniformly distributed Looksmaxxing technique. On the other hand, we got the opposite flow diagram for things that are looks deterioration. Gain fat, your whole entire curve will move to the left. You get crooked teeth because you stop wearing your retainer, your whole entire curve will shift to the left. Stained teeth, the whole curve will shift to the left. And there's much more listed here, which will negatively impact your rating all across every male archetype. Linear increase towards masculinity. These features benefit masculine men far more than pretty men. Sure, they benefit them a little bit, as denoted by a small arrow, but it's very minor, if at all. Examples include Botox lowering for the brow ridge, really decreasing the eye-eyebrow distance to make them look more masculine. Jaw and chin fillers. This is a huge one here. If you want to impact your hyper-masculine appearance and you fit into that archetype, then getting an overdeveloped jaw and chin actually benefit you. Growing a light stubble and many other Looksmaxxing techniques which push you further in that area. And then here is a negative flow diagram which is distributed towards hypermasculine men, meaning it detracts from them more than from the pretty men. Now we have this linear increase which is distributed towards the pretty men, meaning it benefits pretty men more than masculine men. That could include growing out your hair, although that is somewhat nuanced, as examples like Jason Momoa exist. Getting a hair transplant and even rhinoplasty, basically getting a thinner nose, a smaller, thinner nose, will benefit a pretty man far more than a masculine man. On the opposite side of the spectrum here, we have hair loss, balding. These will negatively impact a pretty man far more than a hypermasculine man. Even receiving a nose-related injury during sports. You know when there's UFC fighters and they get that cauliflower ear, I think it's called? Well, that will negatively impact a pretty man far more drastically than a masculine man. And then we got a logarithm. So this is increasing at a decreasing rate from pretty men to masculine men in terms of increasing their attractiveness. It's a Looksmaxxing technique that benefits the masculine men the most, but still benefits everybody quite a bit, unless you're a soft boy, where it then gets quite low. This means gaining muscle, thickening up your neck, and becoming that shredded aesthetic god, becoming Ziz. Even pretty men have a sizable gain from it, and Chads definitely benefit a ton from gaining muscle. It's rather just the really soft boys, the ones that are on that tail end, which don't benefit that much. In hypermasculine men, this is the ultimate thing for you. Gain lean, contractile tissue. On the other hand, losing muscle will destroy a masculine man, and having a pencil neck is not a benefit for anyone, especially not masculine men. Now we got a logarithm which is benefiting the pretty men the most. Dermal fillers and lip augmentation. For pretty men, having plump lips is so important. On the other hand, microneedling skin and getting softer skin, really taking care of that youthful, soft, beautiful skin is highly critical for the pretty boy. On the other hand, we got the reverse situation where we got things that are taking away a lot from pretty and even Chads. Finally, a cubic function. This benefits masculine men immensely. Chads, not so much, if at all. And pretty men drastically decreases. Growing a long beard, that is very good for the very masculine man. Oversized chin, oversized jaw, wearing rugged clothing, maybe even having a scar on your face. That will definitely give a hypermasculine man, in some cases, that unique edge. You got the opposite effect. Being small, different from losing muscle and having a thin neck. You can be muscular and thin. Pretty boys do benefit from gaining muscle. However, they can get away with being much thinner in general general with a smaller frame, and wearing trendy TikTok clothing really benefits them. So the cubic function is absolutely aligned for them. But for the masculine man, doing any of this stuff, losing muscle, getting more feminine looking, this stuff will destroy his appearance. 3 different individuals where we will rank their masculinity and determine where they stand in terms of attractiveness across all archetypes. Let's do it. There's face 1, remember him from my previous video. Face 2, a new guy, and face 3, who's also from my previous video. There's a reason I picked each of these individuals, as I got a lot of comments that were giving me some flack for giving face number 1 and face number 3 a 6. Some people argued that face number 1 and face number 3 were Chad lights, a 7 out of 10. We are going to get right into this. Remember our table here. Here's face number 1's traits plotted on this chart. Face number 2 plotted. And finally, face number 3. The yellow dots are meaningless. They're outside of the bounds of the actual thing, into the cartoon zone. This means that these traits are not very attractive and should be removed from our analysis. To simplify everything, now we can see face 1, 2, and 3, and the amount of traits that reside in each level of masculinity. Boom. So it's pretty obvious now. Face number 1 is a more masculine man. He's not hyper-masculine, rather, but he is definitely closer to the masculine side of the spectrum. The guy in the middle, definitely the closest to the blended masculinity area. And finally, face number 3 definitely has a prettier appearance than Chad or hyper-masculine. The reason I show this is that this is the idealistic states of the hyper-masculine, the Chad, and the pretty boy. If you really wanted to exactly fit into the criteria mathematically of each, you would have to get all 13 dimorphic traits in one box. And we could see for our previous examples, there is some randomness, and that's normal. That's how humans are. In fact, most people have a scattering of traits all over the place in terms of masculine, Chad, pretty boy, and as a result to that, there is no clear trend. They don't actually conform to any of these archetypes. The majority of people I rate do not have a clear trend. This is how the masculine to feminine men, they're distributed. You can see that these 3 men, they're sort of in the middle range more. There's a huge difference between the soft boy and the pretty boy here, as well as the hyper masculine guy here and face number 1. So if we rate each of these guys, this is the ratings that I would give them. I gave face number 1 a 6, but guess what? He definitely is a 7. He's definitely a 7 from a more masculine lens, not the hyper masculine, the masculine lens. Face number 2 definitely has a much more uniformly distributed masculinity. As a result of this, he gets a 7 out of 10 in terms of the Chad rating lens. Finally, face number 3 receives a 6 out of 10 from the Chad rating lens, but a 7 from the pretty boy lens. So you guys were right all along saying, no, he's a 7. Well, he's a 7 when you push the masculinity spectrum a little bit closer to the pretty boy lens. Time to Chadify. I created a website. This is where I've been for the past month. I do apologize on the infrequent uploads. Face number 1, his maximum rating that he could ever receive is a 7 out of 10 at this current time for a slightly masculine bias, while he gets a 6 out of 10 in terms of the Chad or blend level of masculinity. Let's Chadify face number 1. Boom. Wow. So we can take note of is as his curve shifts here, see that little blip at the very end there that he gets from growing out his hair. He benefits the blend and the slightly prettier aspects of his curve a bit more and complements his very masculine appearance. You can see most of the Looksmaxxing techniques employed for face number 1 confined to the upward sloping ones that positively affected masculine men more than pretty men. Face number 2, the blend appearance guy. Sure, he's not rated that great from the pretty or the masculine lens, but in the middle, he's doing pretty well with his 7 out of 10. Let's Chadify him. You can see equal distribution of his improvement, and wow, look at his face. I think he's the first person we rated so far that has a butt chin or a cleft chin. One thing we gotta say about face number 1, as we see his face transforming, he definitely has a superior eye area. In fact, I would argue that it barely required any change whatsoever, and rather the main points that we had to fix was bringing his hairline down, fixing up his skin, lowering the redness, giving him a bit of a tan, getting rid of some oiliness and some fine lines, as well as improving his upper lip. Face number 3. He's a 7 out of 10 in terms of the pretty area. Time to Chadify. You can see how the curves definitely impact the blend, the pretty, those areas a lot more. Sure, he's improved all across his curve, but the bias is towards the pretty side. So those previous Looksmaxxing flowcharts, they're biased towards the pretty side. Those are the ones that he needed to do. To grow out his hair, to get really soft skin. We didn't need to bring his brow ridge down too much because he has a prettier appearance. And of course, canthoplasty, blepharoplasty, these affect everything equally. Uniformly distributed improvement, hence arrows at the top. Face number 1 is definitely the most masculine. Face number 2 is somewhere in between. Each of them require slightly different Looksmaxxing techniques. Each one of these men has a slight bias towards different realms of masculinity. It's just absolutely incredible to see people Chadified. I gave them all long hair. Why? Because long hair is an extremely underrated thing for men. And we can see that face number 3 likely benefits the most from it. Why? Because he started off with a prettier appearance. And guess what? The flow diagram displays it as such. For the prettier men, you get more of a positive impact. Whereas the left side guy gets a benefit from getting stubble. Do you think face number 3 would benefit from having stubble? Absolutely not. Again, the guy in the middle, he definitely has the best of both worlds. With those small adjustments we made to him, he absolutely does fit the Chad demographic. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys next time.